This is Dr. John Brimhall. I'm in Colorado, and I'm going to host tonight Dr. Mark Harris. And to have Mark as a friend is beyond my imagination. If you ever watched the show Good Will Hunting, you saw that he was a genius. Although Mark does have, Dr. Mark has a lot better vocabulary than he did. He's even more of a genius than what you saw in Good Will Hunting. And he's so humble. He gave us like a one-liner in the program talking about homecoming, but I have persuaded him to give us just a little bit of who he is, because it's probably like nobody you've ever met before. Dr. Harris, I've asked him to do some research on the mitochondria, and as you know, I formulate nutrition. He's tested 3 different products I have formulated, and what I've heard so far, the last one with OHS is by far the best, even though the others were amazing. So I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Mark Harris. He is an ND, among other things. So, Dr. Mark.
Hello, Dr. John. Good evening, everybody. Okay, John kind of pried some of my educational background out of me. And I've been testing mitochondria. I have a device in my office, which I will kind of show you how that works at homecoming. But I've been testing mitochondria for about 15 years. And I don't go into anything lightly. I've got my initial education is as a researcher, and I research everything. I read the literature, and I read it critically. And I have the education to understand the literature and read it with scrutiny. I'm a naturopath. I'm a medical doctor. I've got PhDs in biochemistry, physiology, and biology. And I earned those degrees at 13 years of age. Now, I've been in medical practice for 42 years. I see patients from all over the world. And as soon as someone comes to my office, the first thing I want to do is test their mitochondria. Why do I want to test mitochondria? Well, I think this is probably the most important thing in health. Now, mitochondria, just let me give you a little disclosure statement because I just want to let you know where I'm at and what I'm doing there. Okay, so basically, I'm not affiliated with any supplement company, publishing company. I will get no financial benefit from any information presented today. What I want is for you and your patients to get healthier. That's what I'm here for. So now the mitochondrial, we can break mitochondria down into 2 different broad categories. We have something called mitochondrial storage diseases, and some of these are not compatible with life, and they affect really everything. And the ones that are not compatible with life, those are not the patient base we're going to see. They usually will not get past 10 weeks of gestation. But the other ones, as they are born, they can have problems in virtually every system in their body. Because really the only place you don't have mitochondria are your mature red blood cells. Every place else has multiple copies. Something like a brain cell or a heart cell might have 5,000 mitochondria per cell. An oocyte, an egg, has 100,000 mitochondria per cell. And a sperm, not that many. So mitochondria health is health, because anything that affects you affects your mitochondria. So let's go now into mitochondrial discrepancy. Now, discrepancy is not a mitochondrial disease, not a genetic disease, but mitochondria need various things to work properly, and there can be many causes. Now, as you take a breath, you get oxygen into your lungs. It goes to your heart, out to your arteries. And then 95% of it is used in your mitochondria. So if you've got a problem in your heart, your lungs, your arteries, or your mitochondrial or cellular membranes, you already have a problem because oxygen is not being properly delivered. So then when we get to mitochondria have things that have to happen before fuel gets to them, and a lot of things that have to happen once fuel gets to them. So let's go over some of those things. Okay, now, in our regular genetic makeup, 3% of our genes are there for mitochondrial function. They are the powerhouse of our cells, but there's so much more than that. We manufacture proteins in our mitochondria. We actually have ribosomes inside of them. And then 60%, and the energy molecule we call ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and 60% of it goes to making more ATP. So, and we can make more mitochondria, we can have mitochondria die, and we can code for them, but we have to be kind of careful of how much they make, because oxygen is not just all good. Oxygen makes energy. It also makes oxidative damage. And it can get to the point where we have too much oxidative damage, and that then is going to be detrimental to our cells. Okay, so we're to ATP usage in cardiovascular health. So basically anything in cardiovascular you can see, from angina to hypertension, congestive heart failure, ischemia, heart attack, all this is a mitochondrial problem. Now over here, we have the adenine molecule. Adenine is part of adenosine triphosphate, but at this point it's just adenine. So it's a double-membered ring, a 6-carbon and a 5-carbon ring, and then right in here, as it's attached to ATP, when you have enough ATP, you get one of the feedback signals to your cells to stop making ATP is having enough adenosine triphosphate, enough ATP. That's not the only signal, but it's one of them. Now, just below it, we have the caffeine molecule. Now, the side chains are different. There's methyl groups over here. We have nitrogenous groups here, but the backbone is identical. And the active site is the same. So when we drink caffeine, it feeds back and tells our mitochondria to slow down ATP production. Now it does interfere with a chemical in the brain that gives brain a little bit of sharpness, but overall reduces ATP. So a lot of these studies come out about caffeine and the health benefits of caffeine. Well, this is the deal breaker, because if you're slowing down mitochondrial function, you are on the road to destruction. Now, adenine is a purine. Purines are part of DNA and RNA, and they're part of that process also. And then we can have something called purine leakage. Now, as mitochondria start to decay, and they can go through one of 3 processes. They can go through autophagy, where they will basically be altruistic, give up their good parts to feed other mitochondria, and then the other parts will be recycled. They can go through apoptosis. I know it's spelled A-P-O-P, but it's the second P silent, and all of us have been pronouncing it wrong for a long time. Apoptosis, where they just kind of die, and that's all right. Or they can go through necrosis. And necrosis is going to leak purines and cause inflammation all throughout the cells. And that's something we just do not want to happen. Okay, now in the nervous system, mitochondria will affect virtually everything. Now there's an interesting thing that happens in the brain. In the synapses, we have what are called the terminal boutons. That's where the synapses come together. And the mitochondria in the terminal boutons will actually migrate around the cell to help transmit energy for the production of neurochemicals. And about 60% of the mitochondria in a nerve cell, and you might have 5,000 in that cell, will actually move about the cell for this function. As that function starts to decline, they've seen that in Alzheimer's disease, in Lou Gehrig's disease, in Parkinson's, in all the neurodegenerative things that none of us ever want to get. And the mitochondrial DNA is also starting to decline. So mitochondria have DNA that are separate from the rest of the cell. It's fairly rudimentary, but it's necessary so it can have local control. Because sometimes you need local control, not the whole cell functioning. You just might need a few mitochondria to pump up their function. So as we start to lose mitochondrial function, we start to get more free radicals. And then we're going to get more damage to the cell, to our mitochondria, and to our health. So as I said, all the diseases we do not want to get, these are mitochondrial in origin, not exclusively, but the other things that affect it are what we eat and how well our blood sugar is functioning, but that affects you at a mitochondrial level. Okay, now let's talk about fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. We basically have two pathways that we can use. We can use several pathways to make energy in our mitochondria, but we have two main pathways, is either from glucose or from fat. Now, the glucose pathway has a byproduct of lactic acid. We also make pyruvate, and pyruvate is going to then change to acetyl coenzyme A, otherwise known as acetate, and that is the start of mitochondrial function. But if you are not burning fat efficiently, you are burning glucose, and you're burning lactic acid. Now, you can recycle lactic acid in something called the Cori cycle, but you can't do it for long. You can make two pyruvates, and to recycle lactic acid into glucose, you're using up 6 ATPs. So if you're making 2 and you're using 6, you can't sustain that. And that's why you don't see sprinters sprinting for 5 miles. Really, as much as you can sprint is about a quarter mile. And those quarter milers are usually on the side of the track laying down and maybe throwing up after this point. And their muscles are burning. Why? Because they're building up lactic acid. It's just an energy debt they can't recover from right away. Well, in fibromyalgia, this is what inflames the muscles. In chronic fatigue syndrome, this is the same thing, as they are such very closely related conditions. So we work on these people's mitochondria, and fibromyalgia goes away. Because all the massage therapy or adjustment of bones or rolfing in the world will not fix this if you have acid in your tissues. And if you are not burning fat efficiently, you divert to glucose. And then this is a dirtier fuel. So lactic acid builds up in all our tissues. And this is also the preferred fuel for cancer cells. Okay, so now let's back up a little bit and look at ATP. Now we had that adenine molecule we talked about. We have the triphosphates. And then hooked up right in the middle is ribose, and these two together are adenosine. But now let's talk about ribose a little bit, because we just talked about if you divert to glucose, you are making lactic acid and some energy from it. But there's a second pathway that glucose can take, and that's the pentose phosphate pathway. And that's going to come up a couple times in our discussion this evening. But if you are making energy from glucose, you are not using that in the pentose phosphate pathway, and you are not making enough ribose. Now, you are not making enough ATP, because without ribose, you do not have adenosine. So this is why you're seeing fatigue, lactic acid buildup, and not enough ATP. You'll still make some ribose, but the only place you make ribose is in your pentose phosphate pathway and nowhere else. This is the one sugar that is the crucial sugar in our bodies, and we only make it in one place. Okay, now, here's the pentose phosphate pathway. So we have the oxidative phase is the burning of glucose. We have a non-oxidative phase that's going around. And we're making ribulose 5-phosphate to ribose 5-phosphate. Then we can make DNA and RNA. We can make coenzymes. We can make ATP. We're going to use up a couple of NADs in this point. NAD, nicotinic adenine dinucleotide phosphate, and the N-nicotine, vitamin B3. And then we're going to use up some glutathione in here also. So we already see, even in the pentose phosphate pathway, which is crucial to the mitochondrial pathway, we already have a couple of nutrients that are crucial. We're already having glutathione, we're already having vitamin B3, and then of course we really want to make ribose. If we're not, we're going to need ribose. Okay, then we talked about the Cori cycle a moment ago. So you have glucose, and this actually happens outside of the mitochondria, so it's called lactate fermentation. And then if you build up lactate, it goes down into your liver, and then can be, through gluconeogenesis, made back into glucose, either stored as glycogen or used by the muscle again, and then fueled, and then you're going to make more lactate. So again, you can't do this for very long. It takes you, this pathway, you get 2 ATPs. Recycling it, you use up 6. You can't maintain that. Short sprint or not very much physical activity. If you're in this mitochondrial pathway, you're getting fatigued walking upstairs. You're getting fatigued going to the mailbox. You're getting fatigued doing virtually anything that requires just a few minutes of activity. Okay, so we were talking about pyruvate. Pyruvate can be made from glucose, can be made from fat, and then most of the time, pyruvate, we talk about it either in the Krebs cycle, the Krebs cycle, something we've all learned about and forgotten about many times in our life. But in the Krebs cycle, we churn out pyruvate, and then it's pictured as going to acetyl coenzyme A to be used in the mitochondria. Well, there's an intermediate step. So this is called the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So pyruvate is made in the mitochondria, goes through this enzyme system, hydroxyethyl TPP, to lipoamide, then to acetyl coenzyme A, and there's a byproduct where you're using up some energy transferring electrons to do this. Now, hydroxyethyl TPP, the TPP, thiamine pyrophosphate. Thiamine, vitamin B1. If you don't have vitamin B1, you are not going from pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A. So B1 in an active form, most B vitamins are in a inexpensive form. So you go to one of the big box stores and buy a B vitamin, it's going to be in a virtually non-absorbable form. Why? They're less expensive. So you can make a cheap supplement, and you're getting what you're paying for. So first step that we've already seen a couple things, FAD, flavin adenine dinucleotide, flavin, riboflavin, vitamin B2. Already, you need that thing. We haven't even got to mitochondria yet, but this is all upstream. And without these, mitochondria don't have a fighting chance. Okay, so we're going to go into acetyl coenzyme now, assuming we made this stuff. You can make it from glucose, you can make it from fats, and you can make it from ketones. These are all kind of ways you can do it. You can also make it from lactic acid, but we just talked about that. It's not efficient. And you can make it from glutamate. Now, the lactic acid glutamate pathway is the preferred pathway of cancer cells. So this is nothing we want to foster in our mitochondrial health. And this is partially diet, and this is partially proper nutrition to the mitochondria. Okay, so now let's look at the electron transport chain. Now this happens inside the mitochondria. There are 5 what are called complexes or cytochromes. Complex 1 is where ACT will enter, acetyl coenzyme A enter, either be burned from a fat cell, from a glucose cell. Fat cells or ketones enter at complex 2. So as basically electrons churn down this pathway in the presence of oxygen, they dump out the protons. Proton is a hydrogen molecule, most abundant molecule in the universe. Okay, so we send it down. Each step requires coenzyme Q10 right in between them, every single one. Then you get over here, and then this is called the ATP pump. So this churns out, it adds a phosphate to ADP in the presence of magnesium and not without it. So there's another nutrient we need. And then it makes ATP and then recycles. So let's go a little more different into each individual part of the complexes. So cytochrome complex 1, NADH dehydrogenase. This is the first one that was just pictured in the last slide. This one right here. Okay, so we have this thing called flavin mononucleotide. Again, flavin, riboflavin, vitamin B2, NAD, niacin. We need iron in here. We need sulfur, and then coenzyme Q10. This is also where melatonin works in the body. Melatonin is not just about sleep. Melatonin is anti-cancer. Melatonin is an antioxidant. Melatonin makes all your hormone receptor cells more receptive to their receptors, and melatonin fuels the first part of making mitochondrial energy. I just want to go back one more slide because there's another interesting fact, because this is always pictured all the time. This is the inner mitochondrial membrane. This is the space, and not pictured here is the outer membrane. But this particular setup here, well, first it gets a little more complex. We form something called supercomplexes, where 1 and 3 and 4 might get together, or 1 and 3 get together. And they have functions that way, but it's not germane to the part of today's discussion. But if you look at an inner mitochondrial membrane, it's folded into what are called cristae. A lot of surface area, just like brains are folded. And you can have 10,000 copies of the cytochrome system in each mitochondria. Okay, so now we go to complex 2. Now this is called succinate dehydrogenase. This is also used in the Krebs cycle. It's the only one that is used in both the electron transport chain and in the Krebs cycle. Now once again we require FAD in here, and cardiolipin is a fat. So that is important for the transport of the electrons to the protons in the membrane. And then the FAD, and then we're going to do this succinate fumarate, but that is just part of the byproduct of the flavin adenine dinucleotide being oxidized and reduced to have the electron flow go through the membranes. Okay, now we get to number 3, which is called cytochrome C reductase. This requires iron and sulfur, and then vitamin C, and BHB is beta hydroxybutyrate. Now this is often listed in a list of ketones, beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone. Beta hydroxybutyrate is not actually a ketone. It's a precursor to acetoacetate, which is the main ketone. And why are ketones good for your mitochondria? They just feed into the mitochondria by passive diffusion. They don't really need anything else to get in there, so they're a very clean fuel. So complex 3, it's the smallest of the complexes. It transmits 2 protons, but it still has to happen. So vitamin C, beta hydroxybutyrate. So vitamin C we can get from our diet, we can get from our supplements. Beta hydroxybutyrate is available as a supplement or from a dietary use. Cytochrome complex 4. We're going to get to this one a little bit more, but this is the rate limiting step. Basically, you're dumping out 4 protons here, and here you require copper. And then you can get inhibition of this. Now, nitric oxide. There was a Nobel Prize awarded for nitric oxide. But nitric oxide is not always good. If you have inducible nitric oxide, this is induced by too much oxidative damage. And now this is going to form peroxynitrite. This is one of the nasties of all the nasties. This is going to screw up your mitochondrial pathway. This is going to screw up your methylation pathway. Okay, and this is where carbon monoxide will harm you. Carbon monoxide displaces oxygen. This is where cyanide kills you. Cyanide affects complex 4. You don't pass electrons, and you die in a few minutes. And hydrogen sulfide is actually more toxic than cyanide, but we don't tend to produce it in as high an amount. And actually right now, something that's just come down the pike for acute hydrogen sulfide or cyanide poisoning, they're using hydroxycobalamin, a form of vitamin B12, because it binds these things onto it and the body rids itself. But you got to get to it pretty darn fast. So that's complex 4, and then complex 5 is where you're making ATP. So to attach a phosphate to ATP, you require magnesium, and you're also using more of the same NAD, FAD, NADPH molecules. And then to strip off a phosphate to use that energy, you also require magnesium in there. Okay, so energy. We have what happens inside the mitochondria. That's what we just went over. Oxidative phosphorylation. And we have things that can happen outside the mitochondria. And that is the glucose pathway, and that's called glycolysis. So now we're going to look at a couple steps within the mitochondria, and we kind of just looked at this, but I want to bring up plants a little bit. Here it shows better the transfer of the electrons to the inner mitochondrial space. We have the outer mitochondrial membrane and the inner membrane called the cristae. So basically, as we're transferring electrons, we're doing this, and we're metabolizing, we're giving off water, and it doesn't show here, and CO2. When we break down food, that's the byproduct, water and CO2. And plants like CO2. Now, plants have everything in their cell walls that we have in our mitochondrial membranes, and they have one extra cytochrome right in there. And with that, they can metabolize light and burn CO2 to make oxygen. Otherwise, the cells are exactly the same. So were it not for mitochondria, we would not have plants. We would not have people. We would not have elephants. No fish. We'd be a planet of single-celled bacteria. So we are not. We have mitochondria. Okay, now, seems like a good thing to make energy. Just churn it down there and use it up. Sounds good. But maybe we don't want to do that all the time, because basically we want to control it. Because as we talked about before, oxygen is not all good. We have oxidative stress. And we may have to slow it down. We may have to speed it up. We can have a train wreck. So why we need to slow it down? Let's say we're out exercising. We're ramping up our mitochondria. Then we stop exercising. If we keep going at that speed of mitochondrial energy, we're just going to make a lot of mitochondrial oxidative stress. So you kind of see marathoners, by the time they're retiring at age 35 or 40, they're looking 60 or 70. Why? Too much oxidative stress from the mitochondria. Okay, we need to speed up our mitochondria. Maybe we just started exercising. So basically, when we have more oxidative stress, it does code in the mitochondrial membrane to slow down production, as does having enough ATP. And then also we might want to slow it down to heat us up. We're warm-blooded. So this happens primarily in brown adipose tissue, or what is called brown fat. And mitochondria there do not make a lot of energy. They make a lot of heat. This is why we are warm-blooded. Without mitochondria and brown fat, we're reptiles. Okay, now, if you have various, say, large infectious condition, a big stress, you can have heavy metals. You can then go into this nitrogen oxide peroxynitrite pathway. And now we have lost the negative feedback loop of mitochondrial function. This becomes a positive loop and just continues on. And if we don't do something to control this, this is mitochondrial death. This is going to break down methylation pathways as well. And now people are doomed. So this is, train wreck is, by the time your patients are here, they've got one foot in the grave and one on a banana peel. But, okay. So now, what do we do about the free radicals? Okay, so we have a couple things for free radicals. Couple of things we talk about, SOD, superoxide dismutase. Now there's different superoxide dismutases. There's one that's bound to manganese, and this is the manganese molecule pictured in the middle of superoxide dismutase. Copper will form in a different SOD. So we have about 3 or 4 different SODs, superoxide dismutases, and these are the primary intracellular antioxidants. We have things, other nutrients that work for for oxidative damage outside the cells, but they don't work so much inside the cells. We need both, because we get oxidative damage in the cells and outside the cells. Catalase, this is made inside the cells also, and glutathione. Now glutathione, for many years, to take it externally, we had no way to do it, because it didn't cross the gut mucosa barrier. So we'd give high doses of N-acetylcysteine, which is still a good way to do it. So cysteine, L-cysteine, and acetylcysteine is a good way to make glutathione, because not only will we absorb it, but it will pass the blood-brain barrier, and then we can manufacture glutathione within our brains. Okay, alpha-lipoic acid. And now this is an interesting one. This is both water-soluble and fat-soluble. Only one known to do that. We make it, but by the time mitochondria start declining, we're not making enough of it. So we're going to want that nutritionally. Now we're going to talk a little bit more length about PQQ, pyroquinoline quinone. This is one of the more interesting ones that's come down the pike in the last 3-4 years. Now you can get PQQ, you can get pyroquinoline quinone in food. And very often when I'm talking about food to my patients, I'm just kind of giving them bad news about their food they're eating. So now we're going to have a bit of good news. The food that is most dense in PQQ is cocoa, chocolate. You can have 800 micrograms per kilogram. So a kilogram is close to 2.5 pounds. I know a few people might really want to do that, but probably they're not going to eat the cocoa because it's kind of dry, and you put in the chocolate, it's not quite the same thing. You need closer to 4 to 5 pounds, and it's still not a therapeutic dose. Now, PQQ, you have to do a significant dose with probably a single exception, and that is the predigested form. And that is the form that we're going to be talking about in just a minute, because that you don't need as high a dose and you get much more bang for your buck. Now, PQQ does two things that really nothing else does. PQQ both stimulates mitochondrial function and acts as an intermitochondrial antioxidant. Everything else is doing one or the other. PQQ is the only thing known that does both. Okay, now there's other things we're going to need also. For the outside the mitochondria, we have vitamin A, and that's really vitamin A. That's not beta carotene. They're not the same thing. They do not transfer really efficiently at all. So you need real vitamin A. Vitamin E, hopefully in a mixed form. Manganese we talked about as part of superoxide dismutase. The same with copper. Now, pycnogenol is from pine tree bark, and that has been shown to be one of the strongest antioxidants in the body. Selenium falls in that category, and there's one other thing about selenium we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, and turmeric. Now, turmeric might be the strongest anti-inflammatory herb known, and it's been long thought that curcuminoids in turmeric were the really strongest thing in there, but it's found turmeric all by itself works quite strongly. So turmeric by itself, with or without pepper, and then curcumin in a formula is going to be really the high anti-inflammatory component. And anytime you have oxidative damage, you have inflammation. Okay, now we're going to go back. This is another picture of cytochrome C oxidase, or cytochrome 4. This is a molecular drawing of cytochrome 4. And I think this is absolutely beautiful. I made a poster of this. I've got it hanging in my living room, got it framed. Perhaps too much information. Okay, now, thyroid connection here. Basically, right down in the bottom of this molecule, you've got something called a VR subunit. Now, thyroid hormones, we're kind of familiar with T4. We're kind of familiar with T3. There's also a T2, a T1, and a T0. Now, T2 has kind of not been in the literature for 130 to 150 years, but kind of started showing up in 1996. And it looks like it might be potentially the most important thyroid hormone. So when you were taking thyroid hormone in a form of synthroid or levothyroxine, that's T4. And then if you take something like Armour thyroid or West thyroid, that's T3. And then we have 5 enzyme systems that help convert T4 and T3 into T2, T1, and T0. And they're dependent on the mineral selenium. So once again, selenium is far more than an antioxidant. So with selenium, we convert to T2. That then comes to the VR subunit on cytochrome C4, and that becomes the rate-limiting step for mitochondrial function. Now, probably the product I'm liking best for thyroid is OptiThyroid. It has the desiccated thyroid, has T4, T3. Now, desiccated thyroid is not the exact same ratios that humans make. It's as close as we can get. But it has the selenium, it has the cofactors. So when you take it, you can make T2, you can make T1, you can make T0, and the selenium lets you convert them back and forth. And then cytochrome C oxidase, with its subunits, can then transfer the electrons for the final push to making ATP. Okay, and then folate. We're going to make a little bit of a talk about folate because folate is working as an upstream function for ATP. Now, folate is working primarily in the methylation pathway, and methylation pathway could be a 4 to 5 day talk all by itself. That's good additional things about mitochondria. Of course, I'll be talking in much more detail about mitochondria at homecoming this year because I get 2 whole hours to give you some really good mitochondrial information, even more than we're getting tonight, and I think it'll be some things you can take home and use Monday morning. So we got the MTHFR gene, which has kind of become popular. People talk about it, but there's so much more than MTHFR. So first thing I'll say about this is folic acid is different than folate. Folic is man-made, and for many years, no one had any idea how to make folate stable to put in a multivitamin or a mineral. So everyone recommended folic acid, but it doesn't have the same biological activity in 30 to 70% of the population. And in that population is going to block folate from doing its job. Well, folate is going to kind of churn through a couple cycles and go into the methionine pathway. And that's basically to make SAMe. And from there, you're going to make creatine. And creatine is then used to transport and break down fatty acids to use them in your mitochondria, because you can't use them in the big form. You got to break them down to two unit forms. And carnitine and creatine are going to be functioning from that. And this is where we're making this in our body. So if we don't get enough folate, or we're given folic in a vitamin, we've already screwed up this pathway. So we're already having precursor problems to breaking down fatty acids. Okay, so basically of all the nutrients I said, I've been testing and using mitochondrial products for close to 20 years. And let me just give you one mitochondrial story. This was a 64-year-old woman, and I'll kind of show you her results at homecoming. Basically tested her mitochondria, and she had the mitochondria of a 30-year-old, and she had absolutely no health complaints. Her bowels worked great. She slept great all night. She had energy all day long. Everything was as good as it could be. 10 years in a row, as good as it could be. Year 11, her mitochondrial test, I like to do them once a year, mitochondrial test was down by 30%. I asked her, did you stop your hormones? She said, no. I said, did you change your diet? She said, no. I asked, did you change your exercise? She said, no. I said, what's changed in the past year? And she said, it's been a very stressful year. So stress alone is enough to screw up your mitochondria. Okay, now I've used a lot of formulas over the years. My friend John has done 3 great formulas with various companies he worked for. Before I even knew him, I was using other mitochondrial formulas. And basically, if you give a patient a mitochondrial formula, will they get better? Absolutely. Is that all you need to do? Not even close. But if you have a mitochondrial disease that you did not perish in the first 10 weeks of life, mitochondrial formulas will make you better. If you have mitochondrial discrepancy, you can eat better, but you're still going to need a mitochondrial formula. Now, OptiMitoForce is the best one I've seen, and this is by doing mitochondrial testing. And what I like especially about this is the pre-digested forms. So patients often ask me, well, how do they pre-digest? So I tell them we feed them to babies and we get it out the other end. No, these are enzymatically digested. So this way you don't need as high a dose. And then you can, and frankly, most mitochondrial formulas are far more expensive. Now this does not contain coenzyme Q10 or ribose, which I think are 2 of the most crucial things. So why aren't they in there? Well, you need a pretty high dose of ribose. So you can put them in there, but then you'd be taking 8 or 10 a day instead of 2 a day. CoQ10, same thing, you need a pretty high dose. So if you're taking separate, usually ribose is better as a powder anyway, so you can't really put it in a capsule, not in a meaningful dose. So these are going to be a probable excellent addition, and maybe if I can twist John and Doug's arm, maybe we can get a powder of these 2 made up and call it OptiMitoForce cofactors, and maybe we could give that to our patients as well. Okay, so basically any patient with any condition will benefit from better mitochondria. How do we get mitochondria better? Many methods. First step, Opto Mito Force with CoQ10 and ribose. Hopefully we'll get this coming out of Optimal Health Systems soon. John kind of pressed me to really give my educational and background. I don't really like to trumpet my accomplishments, but now I'm going to kind of pester him because I'd like to see OHS make these two products. Okay, so this is pretty much what I've had to say. I'd be happy to take any questions that have come on and answer those for you now.
Well, we're saying we forgot to tell them we were going to have questions.
Oh, okay.
When you do this with patients, and I know you were doing this before I formulated Opto Mito Force with the one that precursed this, and you were getting better results than you had with any other product before this one. I think you told me it didn't matter the sex of the patient, the age of the patient, or the condition named. If you can improve the mitochondria, and you could do that with these products and the techniques that you use, everybody got better. Is that what I heard you say?
Well, basically, I was doing everything with the other formulas, everything else that needs to be done, and everything with this formula, and I got better results with this than any other formula. You still have to do other stuff. You got to have good thyroid, just like I mentioned. You got to do that. But even with the other stuff in the previous formulas and a perfect diet, I'm getting much better results with this. And
I know you're going to show us more at homecoming. Can you give us just a brief overview how you're measuring these? I mean, you measure these with real science standards.
Yes. Okay. So basically, mitochondria are measured. We have something called the RER, or respiratory exchange rate. As you are burning fat or you are burning glucose, you're putting out known amounts of carbon dioxide or oxygen. So based on how much carbon dioxide or oxygen you're putting out, we know if you are burning glucose or you are burning fat. And this can be reproduced, and this is the gold standard. So basically, people sit with a breathing apparatus in their mouth. It feeds them to a machine, and it analyzes what's coming out, glucose or fat, when they are at rest versus when they are exercising. When you are at rest, you should be burning most of your calories from fat. Most people, when I start them out, are burning most of their calories from carbohydrate. They're already on the road to destruction. As you start exercising more, you start to transfer from pure fat burning to both fat and carbohydrate burning. And that shows. And then when you get to a certain level, you go anaerobic, or what is called the VO2 max. And that's something we don't really tend to measure, because that's the point. It's good to spend a little bit of time there, but not much, because that's the point you're doing oxidative damage. So respiratory exchange rate, that's how you measure mitochondria, and really the only way to do it. Because you can't extract mitochondria and put them in a test tube, because people wouldn't tend to like to have them extracted. So this measures both at a resting state and at an exercising state. When you measure an exercising state, we also measure the heart rate while they're doing it, and then we can come up with a proper exercise so they're burning what they want to burn while they're exercising. Because often you'll go to a exercise device at a health club, and they have a little graphic on there, and it says fat burning zone, and then carb burning zone, and then VO2 max. Compared to actual people, those numbers aren't even close. You'll never get to those levels based on those machines. So, but based on what I've done in 15 years of testing, everyone needs mitochondrial help from age 15 on. Lifestyles are not conducive to mitochondrial health. And this thing I use, there's maybe 15 places in the country where people are doing this, and that's about it. So I've been doing it for a long time. I've done thousands of people, so I've seen some absolute trends. And I can pretty much tell when a person walks in what their test is going to look like before I can hook them up. So why do I hook them up? Because they get it in black and white. They see it in front of them. Same reason we do lab tests. We can find things, and they can see it. And they're more motivated to take action. And what I'm going to do at homecoming, I'll kind of show what the machine is. I'll show how we do it. And I'll show the actual results before and after. I'll just do a couple because watching a mitochondrial test is a bit like watching someone on a computer. Interesting, but not that interesting. But the results, very interesting. And we're going to get those results and show them to you. I'd love to be able to test someone there, but the apparatus weighs a few hundred pounds and I just can't fit it in my suitcase.
Mark, just for a minute, I know you don't like to brag on yourself, but help me a little bit. Tell them a little bit what you've done by 9 and what you've done by 13 so they know who they're listening to.
Okay. I grew up in rural Colorado in a town with 18 people in it. Ended up going through a K through 12 and graduated high school. I went to first grade, fourth grade, 7th, and 12th, and then I graduated at 7 years of age. So then I went off to college, and I went to Colorado State as an undergrad because it was where I grew up and didn't want to get that far home because I was just still a little kid. I graduated from Colorado State at age 9, but I didn't get a bachelor's degree at that time. I ended up with my first PhD based on the work I did there. So then at 9, I went to graduate school, and I did 4 degrees concurrently. I did a naturopathic degree. I also did a medical degree. And I did PhDs in biochemistry and in physiology at University of Washington and Vassar University in Seattle. And I got all those degrees at age 13. And by age 13, I had published as lead author 1,400 articles. So
why are you stingy and don't send us more to the Brimhall doctors? We'd love to have you share.
And I'm Brimhall certified.
Right.
And have been for a very long time.
Well, would you tell us just quickly the story about when you were, I think it was just 9 in the math class? And
oh, all right. Okay, so this wasn't actually a math class. Okay, so I started college at age 9, and I was in my very first semester of classes. They just kind of hooked me up for a normal load because they kind of knew who I was but didn't know what I could do at this point. So I'm in a room with maybe 40 other people, and I'm a little bit intimidated because this is more than the people than there are in my hometown. And they're all grown-ups, 18, 19, I'm 7. No, I was 9 by then, pardon me. So 3 weeks into the semester, they give us a pop quiz. And 10 multiple choice questions and an extra credit. So, and this professor said you got 30 minutes to do the quiz, and then class is done for the day. So I did the multiple choice, and for the extra credit, I wrote 6 pages of mathematical formula, turned it in, and walked out of the room. So 2 days later, the professor's name was Bogner, biology professor all those years ago, and he was in a room and the entire math department was in there, and they said, Mark, could you please explain the mathematics that you did here? So my little squeaky 7-year-old voice, I said, well, Dr. Bogner asked us a question, but the textbook he assigned us was published 18 years ago. So since that time, there have been 280 studies that are relevant to the question he asked. But 200 of them were more relevant, but in some of them, and a lot of them, the conclusions were not warranted by the raw data. So I've coalesced all the raw data and re-examined it and put the proper interpretation, and that's the first 3 pages of mathematical formula. Then there were 80 other studies that were relevant, but not as relevant, so there was a 12% variance in those studies. So I had to do a different statistical manipulation to make that relevant, and then for the 12% variance, I had to do some new math. So the first, page 5 is the theorems, and page 6 is the new math, and at the bottom is the answer. And they asked me when I did the new math. I said, well, during the quiz, don't you guys do that? Well, apparently they didn't. So they asked me, did I do it for this class only? I said, no. They said, what did you do? Well, in the spring before I entered school, they sent me my entire curriculum in a kind of brochure form. So I told them I did it for all my classes. And they told me I didn't have to take those classes. So 2 years later, I graduated with a PhD out of my undergraduate career. And I kind of had a choice because I was working with professors all throughout the university because they want me to analyze data like I did in that room that day. And I published 400 articles by the time I graduated as lead author. So that's what I did then. And I didn't think anything of it. I was a little kid. I just thought I was doing what I was supposed to do. And then perhaps at homecoming, I'll tell you the story of why you succuss in homeopathy. It's always been done. But I did a study to figure out why. Maybe I'll tell you that story at homecoming.
All right, okay. We're going to hold you to that. Yeah. Here's something I want the doctors listening and assistants. Now, here's a guy with this kind of background and knowledge. And you know what he does? He uses an adjuster, a percussor, a laser, nutrition, and the same thing. The 6 steps to wellness is a revelation, and this guy was dead for 3 days and was brought back. That's another story, basically in an avalanche. But he's here for a reason. I think God is preserving for us in this time, and he can explain how this product that I developed works so well better than I can. But it's quite a revelation how all these different products that I formulated through the years really were given to me as I would read about them. I do the research, I do kinesiology, I put them on the machine like the ASA, and I found everything that worked. Now he can come back and explain all the chemistry that I have no idea how all that fit together. But together, all of us together are creating miracles for our patients and for each other. That's why we call the 6 steps to wellness mentoring and miracles. And Dr. Mark, you're my miracle. I thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, John. Thank you for saying that as well.
Was there any other questions, Clark?
Yeah, there's several here that have come in while you've been talking. What is the mitochondria test that you use? You mentioned a little bit about that, but
yeah, okay. So this is called a bioenergy tester, but that's words. So basically, I use basically it's a respiratory analyzer that you would just see if people were doing a ergometer and just testing their VO2 max on an exercise bike. Same machine. So that's the same thing we're using. But we have developed software to analyze the respiratory exchange rate and written an algorithm because the respiratory exchange rate, oxygen versus CO2 coming off your mitochondria, and that depends if you're burning glucose or fat, you're putting out a known rate of oxygen or CO2. So that we've written an algorithm to measure it based on the known science that's been around for 40 years. Now, it's a fairly expensive machine. Not everyone's going to have those in their office, but we have a couple of shortcuts we can show you, and we'll show you that at homecoming. And I hope that was a sufficient answer for you. If there's additional questions, please let me know.
okay. Another question here. I compound a T3 and a T4 sustained release capsule. Could I add 200 mcg of selenium to the capsule to generate that T1 and T2 as a compound pharmacist? Question.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And you want to use the form of selenium methylcysteine, which is the food-based form. But yeah, if you put that in, you will have much better conversion. There are 5 enzyme systems that convert different thyroid hormones. They're called D1 through 5, dehydrogenase. They change iodines around. And selenium is the main thing, not the sole only thing, but the main thing that is the cofactor in those enzymes. So yes, if you compound selenium into that T2, T3, T formula, you will get conversion to T2, T1, and T0. And to say one more thing about that, there's more than one T4, there's more than one T3, there's more than one T2, there's more than one T1, there's more than one T0. But selenium is going to let you convert to the 152 known forms of thyroid hormones if you add it to your formula. So an emphatic yes.
And you know, it's interesting too, if you'll note all the Opti products that I formulated. You look at Opti iodine that we did. We have selenium and molybdenum in there that allows that to do that conversion you're talking about. Same with Opti thyroid.
Yes.
You mentioned
Molybdenum is also working in the methylation pathway to help rid the body through glutathione. So molybdenum is in that pathway too. And these pathways work very much together. And then I'll say another word about copper, because these are in these formulas also. And copper, some people are talking that copper is just the worst thing since non-sliced bread. But maybe the worst thing is bread, but that's a different discussion. But organic copper is crucial to life. Inorganic copper is deadly. What do you get in inorganic copper? Most multivitamins and water pipes underneath your home. But in these Mito products, the Opti products, these are whole food products. These are organic copper. This is the kind you want. Then the other place food-wise, nuts and seeds.
Does the Opti Mito Force have the vitamin A, E, Mn, copper, pycnogenol, Se, turmeric?
Yes, it does.
you're welcome.
It has the B1, the B2, the folic acid, zinc, selenium, copper, manganese. Oh, what I didn't mention was phosphatidylcholine. Now, when you look at any kind of cellular membrane, the inner membrane is made of phosphatidylcholine. So, and that's where that cardiolipin comes in also. So, and that's in this formula too. So, and I didn't mention that one. So yeah, that's in there as well.
What would you do differently for one with Hashimoto's, anti-TPO658?
Okay, well, Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease. And autoimmune is a problem of the immune system. So what is going to screw up the immune system? Now, do mitochondria make a difference in immunity? Absolutely. But then you're also looking at vitamin A status, and you've got vitamin A in here. You're going to be wanting to look pretty heavily at the thymus gland. The thymus gland is the educator of the immune system. And then anything going on in the gut, where the gut immune connection is getting more and more elucidated on a day-by-day basis. So you have candida in your gut, you've got dysbiosis, you've got inflammation in your gut. That is going to be a big part of your immune system dysfunction. And that's going to be Hashimoto's or Graves'.
Okay, let's see. How much Opto Mito do you give?
Okay, now because when I was giving the previous formulas, I was giving much higher dosages because with the pre-digested we can go lower. So for the people who are in probably the worst shape, these are the people who are fatigued going to the mailbox, I'm going to give them 2 twice a day. For most people, I'm going to do 1 twice a day, and I'm going to do it with food. And some people are going to need 3 twice a day. Just the people who are less likely to make any other changes in their health. But if they're not making changes in their health, then we as physicians are failing in our ability to motivate them to make change. And how do we motivate them? Give them enough information so they want to make change.
Which Opti products do you have for SIBO, S-I-B-O?
Okay, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, this is a bit of a controversial and a bit of an established function. So I would not call it bacterial overgrowth, I would call it wrong bacteria. Now, typically, when you get a bad bacteria in your gut, it's going to encase itself in a biofilm. Biofilms, the gut has 75% of your immune system. So a bad bacteria doesn't stand a chance with that much immunity there, so it will encase itself in a protein glucose matrix that we call a biofilm. So, and then basically what we have to do at that point is dissolve the biofilm. So there's a couple of herbs, but from a Opti product, I'm going to use enzymes on an empty stomach. Because the enzymes are proteolytic. They'll break down the protein in the biofilm, and then the immune system can get rid of the bacteria. It's really the protection of the bad bacteria that are the problem, not the bacteria themselves. So if you get rid of the biofilm, and then I'm going to use the enzymes for that on an empty stomach, and then you give some good bacteria, it'll just move the bad bacteria out, and the problem will go away. Because most people are saying this is a lifelong condition. Absolutely not. You just got to recognize they're going to form a biofilm. There's a couple other things that are conducive to biofilm formation. A lot of protein formulas use maltodextrin as a sweetener, and that's going to form biofilms. So you don't want maltodextrin in your formulas unless it's the incredibly small amount, and there's no compelling reason to use it. And that's a biofilm former also, and then the bacteria will then hook onto that and then take residence in the intestine. So SIBO is fairly easy to take care of. You just got to digest the biofilm.
Would Opto Mito Force be effective in preventing altitude sickness?
Okay, altitude sickness is a hypoxia condition. Now, typically this occurs in younger people, but it can occur at any age. So when I was talking about the earlier form of now, as you go up in elevation, there is less oxygen in the air. So basically, if you have a mitochondrial problem, this will help. But very often, that problem is going to be something either in the heart, lungs, arteries, or the cellular membranes. And if it's most often going to be a cellular membrane problem from people's diet. So what I'm going to be doing there is the Mito, and I'm going to be adding the EFA in along with it. and that will by and large prevent altitude sickness. And I grew up at 10,400 feet in Colorado. I know altitude sickness. I've been there, I've experienced it. And growing up that high, you actually make thicker blood to carry more oxygen. So about every 3 months, you go up to have phlebotomy to thin the blood out. And as a kid, I didn't really like that very much at all.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. There's lots of thank yous, appreciated, those kinds of things. So.
Okay, it's been my pleasure, and I'm going to have really a whole different presentation at homecoming. Going to talk about the optimal mitochondrial diet and what else you need to do to optimize your mitochondria, because you optimize your mitochondria, you optimize your health.
Thank you, buddy. See you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.